good morning or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Courtney Dogger, and I'm the president of Network 2020, which is a New York-based nonprofit organization that strives to create more informed conversations around global affairs. So we're really delighted today to have Dr. Parag Khanna with us. As many of you know, he is a leading global strategy advisor, world traveler, and best-selling author. He is the founder and managing partner of FutureMap, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. His newest book is The Future is Asian: Commerce, Conflict, and Culture in the 21st Century. And he is the author of a trilogy of books on the future of world order, beginning with the Second World, Empires and Influence in the New Global Order, followed by How to Run the World, Charting a Course to the Next Renaissance, and concluding with Connectography, Mapping the Future of Global Civilization. He is also the author of Technocracy in America, Rise of the Info State, and co-author of Hybrid Reality, Thriving in the Emerging Human Technology Civilization. He was named one of Esquire's 75 most influential people of the 21st century and featured in Wired magazine's Smart List. He holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and bachelor's and master's degrees from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He has traveled to nearly 150 countries and is a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. He will be joined in conversation and led in conversation with Lisa Rhodes, who will be the moderator, and she is the founder and managing partner of a private equity healthcare company. And in this role, she drives the firm's healthcare private equity investment strategy, as well as helps provide capital advisory to healthcare business across the capital structure. She was previously a managing director with the Easton Capital Group, a venture capital firm focused on the healthcare sector, and led sourcing, due diligence, and structuring investments, as well as fundraising activities for the firm. And she also serves on the board of numerous portfolio companies, assisting with strategy, product development, and mergers and acquisitions, and has played an instrumental role in delivering a 5 times increase in the valuation of key investments. Her bio is much longer, but I'm going to stop there. She is also a board member of Network 2020, and for those of you who have participated in our in-person briefings knows that she always asks excellent questions. So we're delighted to turn this over to Lisa and to Parag for what should be a really interesting conversation. So thank you all for joining.
Great. Well, thanks. I think, Parag, you're going to kick us off by giving us some comments, and then we'll get into some questions that we'll have a discussion, and then we'll open it up to the audience for some Q&A. So, Parag, without any delay, thank you so much for your time and for your insights. We're looking forward to your current views, I'm sure, as they're emerging, and we leave the floor to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Lisa. I'm delighted to join you, and I get nostalgic, obviously, to be connecting with anyone in New York or in the U.S. I suppose right now I could only modify the bio that you read up by saying I used to be a world traveler. I think all of us used to be travelers. I've never sat so long in one place in my entire life as right now, but hopefully we'll all get moving again. So let's, but I guess the beauty of technology is we get to be everywhere at once. So we have to look on the bright side. So let me jump right in. I'm going to show just 3 or 4 slides to kick off the conversation. So if we could go ahead to the first one, please. And here what I want to show you is the trend that has been underway for really the last decade, particularly the last 5 years, and even more pronounced since the election of Donald Trump. But to emphasize that this is pre-pandemic, and that is the fact that regionalism in many ways has been displacing globalization in terms of the volume of interactions. Now that actually in many ways has always been true, but it's particularly true now and will be even more pronounced in the future. So again, owing to some nearshoring of production, the shale energy revolution, and war, we arrived at a situation 2018, 2019, where the US was trading more with Mexico and more with Canada than with China. And there are many drivers of that going back in time. In Europe, already 70% of trade has been internal for quite some time. It's mostly, there are export powerhouses in Europe, like Germany, obviously, but the majority of European trade is internal. Now, as you've been seeing in the headlines, they're pushing towards a really record-sized fiscal kind of bailout or a combination of this sort of mutualized debt, which is the holy grail for demonstrating that Europe is not just a monetary union, but can take steps towards a stealth fiscal union, and that's now underway as well. And in Asia, where we've tended to underestimate the extent to which there is self-sufficiency, because the kind of historical view of Asia is that they, meaning Asia, depend on us, the rich world, Europe, United States, because of their export dependency. Yes, many Asian economies are export dependent, but they're much more dependent on each other than they are on the US or Europe. And that's something that we haven't appreciated, because we haven't appreciated how rapidly their wealth has increased and their consumption and how many free trade agreements have been passed and legislated in Asia over the last 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, and going into the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the new trade agreement for the Asian region. So it's really remarkable the extent to which Asia has begun to coalesce. And what tends to happen in a crisis like this is that, just like Europe, they learn the lessons. They learn that they need to, go deeper and wider rather than retrenching. And so, when trade dependency is exposed, the solution is not simply to pump money into the system artificially. The solution is to rapidly reopen and deepen their trade complementarities with each other. So Asians are hyper pragmatist in these matters, and I expect, therefore, based on past patterns and kind of obvious things that we see in the region, that Asia is actually going to further consolidate. Now, the trade war completely accelerates this, as does the actions against Huawei and the desire to nearshore supply chains. So again, it didn't take the most recent actions that the administration has launched around getting TSMC to do a plant in the United States and to block its chip provision to Huawei, to convince Huawei and other Chinese companies like Oppo and others that they need to have their own vertical stack around chips. They started doing that more than 5 years ago, and they're going to ramp that up. So there's going to be even more Asian self-sufficiency there. Samsung is already going to compensate for and substitute for, in many ways, for American chip providers in the Chinese market. So what you get is ultimately not just a domestic national kind of nearshoring and industrial policy. You get something that's much more regional, right? So, and again, for those of us who look at the USMCA, we say, actually, when people talk about nearshoring to to the United States, what they really mean is Mexico, right? Because that's ultimately the country that will benefit the most from a lot of this. Similarly, in Asia, Japan has created a whatever hundreds of billions of dollars fund to sort of divert foreign investment out of China. Most of it's not coming back to Japan, right? It's going to Southeast Asia. It's going to ASEAN, right? Because these are the new low-wage production centers. So bottom line, though, on this is, make where you sell is where the world is going. And that does apply even to Western multinationals, as much as there is political pressure on them to nearshore. Can we go to the next slide, please? Great. So, what does all this mean for China? Now, we've tended to have a very China-centric view of Asia, but, part of what I was mentioning earlier is that really we're entering this fourth wave of Asian growth, where Southeast Asia and South Asia start to pick up the slack. I should add that in India right now, they're all out trying to lure the supply chains from China as well. They succeeded with Apple last year. Their pharmaceutical market is more important than ever. And obviously in the tech sector, you've heard about the deals with Reliance Jio being able to raise, something on the order of 10+ billion. I'm probably understating that by a fair amount, in just the few weeks to launch Reliance Jio's national network. So it's a reminder of just how quickly supply chains can shift and how fungible they are. Now, that's not the way we've traditionally looked at these things. We've thought about foreign investment as something that is very fixed. It's a long-term investment. You're really putting down a lot of capex in a factory or whatever the case may be. The truth is that again, the cost of producing anything has come down drastically. You can more or less substitute for China in many areas. You're not going to have the efficiency of iPhone City outside of China day after tomorrow in Vietnam, right? But over time, you can get there faster than we think you can get there with the right amount of effort. Now, what does this mean for China? So China needs to make friends again, because obviously of the kind of backlash against China that goes back to concerns about the debt trap diplomacy of the Belt and Road Initiative, and that has to do, of course, with the coronavirus. So what are the ways in which China can do that? Well, it's obviously tried this sort of constructive health diplomacy and providing medical equipment, PPE, all this kind of stuff. But obviously that too has had its ups and downs given the faultiness of some of that equipment. And so forth. Now, it can also bring down tariffs on its trading partners. That's something that China very regularly does when its neighbors are in difficult straits economically. It will reduce tariffs so that they can export more to China. The trouble is with that policy is that they've already been doing it. China systematically went about reducing tariffs to every country in the world that is not America. Starting in 2016, as soon as Trump was elected, in order to substitute for dependence on U.S. imports. So you can't really reduce tariffs, further than zero. And in any case, China, given that it's dipping into a current account deficit, doesn't really want to be blowing all this money. It can also invest more in terms of Belt and Road, and in terms of Belt and Road, it can invest more, and that is something that it has been doing in its immediate Asian region. But there are limits to that as well, because we know that countries don't want to absorb a lot of outstanding debt obligations to China. Their economies are not going to be growing as fast as was planned, and so on and so forth. And again, there's the concerns about debt traps. Now, on the geopolitical level, there's also efforts to counter China's infrastructure kind of connectivity diplomacy, and that's what I call the infrastructure arms race. So now, instead of taking on the kind of non-concessionary terms from China, there's a push by Europe, the US, Japan, and others, also multilaterals, to offer more concessional terms of financing. So there's a marketplace out there to compete with China on infrastructure projects as well. So I believe in the long run, what we're going to see is a pretty substantial diluting of China's influence in the region and a return to the kind of traditional pattern that Asia has known for most of the last 4,000 years, which is multipolarity, not really being dominated by any one power. And I think that is what is natural for Asia. And for those of you who are kind of IR theory nerds like me, this is a very important contrast to Western history, where we tend to think of hegemonic stability as the ordering kind of principle and as the norm. In Asia, that's not the way Asia has ever worked, not since the Mongol Empire in the 13th century. And that's not the history that's going to repeat itself now. And point of historical fact, which is obviously relevant, is that it was the Black Death that splintered the Mongol Empire. So if you do think that China is the new Mongols, well, here you also have your new Black Death. And I think a very similar pattern again is going to unfold that will fracture China's leadership in many of these environments. Next slide, please. Great. So I already went through this, but just in terms of, and then please feel free, Courtney, if you like later on, circulate the slides, the deck to everyone if they want to hold on to them. So just a couple of data points that are useful around, as I mentioned, this diversion of China's trade and investment relationships to focus much more on its immediate periphery and much less on North America, South America, Africa, basically any other place. They've realized that they've got to stabilize their relationships in their neighborhood. And that's why whether it's Pakistan or Russia or Kazakhstan, those markets are going to get more attention. So that's generally what I'm sort of demonstrating for you here. Next slide, please. Great. So final point, what does this mean for kind of, geostrategic relations on a kind of intercontinental scale? The three major economic centers of the world are, of course, North America, Europe, and Asia. Europe represents the largest share of global trade, North America actually the least. This is because North America is actually the most self-sufficient, the most autarkic. I get asked like every day, if you could have 5 minutes with Donald Trump, what would you tell him? And I always say I would just show him one picture because I gather he likes pictures more than long, meaty reports. Just this one slide. I would just show him this and talk him through this. And here's what I'm basically saying. To be the world's largest economy does not mean that you're the most influential in global trade, right? Because your preponderance in global trade is a function of how much you actually trade. And if he had seen this in December 2016 or January 2017, I don't think we'd have a trade war right now. Because I think that anyone looking at this realizes that you can't win a trade war when you're not the largest trading power. You can have some influence on the margins. You can help to nudge certain policies. You can have quid pro quos and so forth. But ultimately, Asia in general and China in particular trades again, China's largest trading partner is Asia, right? Its neighbors. Its second largest trading partner is Europe by a wide margin. And the United States is the third, now a distant third in terms of the partnerships that China has in trade. It doesn't need to get fuel from the United States, but it does. It can get soybeans and semiconductors from others. It's just a question of how long it takes to substitute the United States. But just about everything that it gets from the US can be substituted. And this is the theory of kind of permanent substitution. And it's not a new theory. This is what the entire life cycle of empires of the last 500 years is. You substitute from you practice import substitution. You build up your trade surpluses and currency reserves. You invest in the modernization of your own economy and your military, and you start to compete with your original masters and those powers that you were most dependent on for global market share. This is how empires rise. This is how it's always done. What China is doing today is what Europe did for centuries. It's most certainly what Hamiltonianism is about. Even if you haven't seen the musical, this is what Hamiltonian trade policy was, and this is what all European countries did to each other. So China is not doing anything even remotely new here in practicing import substitution. The difference here, and this is the final point, is that the world that many of us grew up in, depending on if you're what side of 30 or what side of 35 you're on, is a world in which transatlantic relations were really the strategic anchor of the global geopolitical and geoeconomic system. What I'm showing you here is that really it's already a Eurasian game. I mean, this data, this is not a forecast. This is 2017 data, right? This is already baked in. And so when you wonder why Europe acts so differently towards Asia, some countries joining Belt and Road, many countries joining the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, having an FTA with Japan, with Korea, with Singapore, pushing for one with ASEAN and with India, while the US pulls out of TPP, right? If you're wondering why Europe acts so differently, again, you don't even have to be particularly literate. You just have to look at this slide. And this tells you pretty much everything you need to know about why you have this divergence in the transatlantic perspective towards the world. And then also there's just basic fundamental geography, right? Really, the Soviet Union collapsed 30 years ago. And since that time, this Eurasian axis has been physically and institutionally deepening through these trade corridors and trade relationships. That's what's gotten us to this 1.6 trillion figure that you see there. Now, if you were to ask me 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what are going to be these numbers? I would tell you that only one number on this map is going to grow. And that's the one that's already the largest, right? Euro-Asian trade is going to continue to grow. You have 600 or 700 million people in Europe, and you have 4.5 billion people in Asia. And you have very little free trade yet between them. And you have huge amounts of infrastructure being built between them. So the only one of these lines that has any upside pushing it forward is the Euro-Asian axis. And so that is where the future really is, it's also in a way where the past was, but I won't get into that too much now. But let me just stop right there. Just hope that that's a useful scene setter, and look forward to the conversation. Thank you again. Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, Lisa.
Wow. Thank you, Parag. That's a lot to digest, but I think what I'm hearing here is that your overall theme is that we're continuing a sort of the process of regional versus a global world, and those regions are very distinct, and the connection between Europe and Asia is much stronger from both a trade perspective and also from a geographic perspective, and you see those growing. We have enormous populations in Asia, we have a very large density population in Europe, and then we have more of a self-sufficient market in the Americas driven by the US economy. So geography plays a role as well as trade plays a role in that. So Very interesting. Lots of different themes to sort of dig in on here. So we're going to sort of start off the conversation by following up on your theme, what you call this debt trap diplomacy, the Belt and Roads Initiative, the perception or the reality of how China's view on using the Belt and Road Initiative and the use of debt. So we all know that their strategy was to use debt to build this infrastructure to support this growth. But how is debt now going to be playing out as we move into this post-pandemic world where we are moving away from this commodity-based economies? We have major portions of the world, such as Latin America and Argentina, about to default yet again, a very much of a historic trend for them. So how do you see debt playing out and this strategy that China's employed playing out sort of on a global basis now?
Great question. So we need to, first of all, this can cut in several ways, and I don't think that there's a global answer. And part of it is the fact that when we talk about emerging markets or frontier markets, we tend to lump very unlike entities together. And this goes back to the BRICS fallacy, for those who remember that horrible acronym that I just can't stand. I'm glad that no one really uses it anymore. But this idea that emerging markets includes, Asia. You can talk about Thailand and Indonesia in the same breath as Turkey and Argentina, but you really can't, right? Argentina is the serial defaulter, whereas Indonesia can offer a 30-year bond in rupiah currency and it'll be oversubscribed. So the truth is that Asia is kind of a realm unto itself at this point. So now let's talk about the debt picture. You do have countries with high debt in Asia, and some of it is, but not nearly as much of it is in US dollars as other emerging markets. Only Indonesia has 25-30% of its outstanding debt in US dollars, but everyone is willing to cover it because it's a huge country, with a high potential, more than 200 million people, rapid growth, modernization, massive infrastructure investment. Now it's raining right now, but I can see Indonesia from my roof. I've been going there for 20 years. It always disappoints, and yet it also gets there in the end, right? Unlike a lot of other countries, that it's just that big. So there's a lot of faith, in this region. So all of that is a backdrop to saying that, some of the countries that, when we talk about debt traps, some countries had high pre-existing debt to international financial institutions. There's a small number of countries whose majority of outstanding debt is to China. And it was to China prior to Belt and Road existing, because no one was issuing debt to Kyrgyzstan and Laos and Mongolia, even before 2014, 2015. So these countries had high debt to China while Belt and Road was still a twinkle in Xi Jinping's eye. So when we look at these countries and we say, oh, look, they've fallen into debt traps. No, they were in debt traps because they have been debt orphans for decades, just like sub-Saharan African countries have. So the fact that a country has taken on more debt in order to invest in growth is not necessarily a bad thing. These countries would never grow if they didn't borrow. Where else would the money come from? Now let's talk about the future and scenarios. I mean, the fact that COVID has come along and that the IMF and World Bank together, an IMF with $1 trillion almost, the World Bank with about 250 billion and growing, spread across and, rapid deployment. You've got to hand it to the IMF and the World Bank. As controversial as they've been in the past, they've moved very quickly in this situation. So offering these credit lines to, most countries in the world right now on very generous terms. So this means that a whole lot of countries that have been too exposed to China now take this opportunity to restructure debt. There's a lot of political pressure on China to write down interest payments, principal, to basically suspend interest payments and potentially principal, and write down these things. All eyes are on China. Obviously, they always are, right? Everything they do is under a microscope. Now more than ever. But when it comes to debt, it was all along. So the smart countries are going to take advantage of the situation in a good way, restructure with China, borrow at good terms from the international community. Moving forward, go for the concessional rates of finance from credible lenders like the multilaterals, and hopefully spend wisely, be less corrupt, diversify, create jobs, and grow their way out of this. and that's what debt is supposed to do in the first place. So the thing is, so look, if a country like Laos, ultimately, keels over, that doesn't mean the end of Belt and Road. It doesn't mean that China has been practicing predatory lending any more than hedge funds practice predatory lending when it comes to the way they handle Argentine debt, right? The fact is, there's some really small, really poor countries out there. Most important thing for our conversation is that Laos is not representative of China's grand strategy. It's not the end all be all. The fate of Belt and Road and the fate of Eurasian infrastructural integration, the greatest mega trend of the 21st century, doesn't really depend on what happens in Laos, right? Like, I love Laos as much as the next guy. I went there for my birthday last year with the family. But the fact is that the fate of Belt and Road hinges on Kazakhstan, on Pakistan, on Russia, on the really big countries that matter. And those countries are playing ball with China. They're hand in glove.
Got it. So just following up on one comment before we leave the area of debt, you're saying that that China is looking at helping restructuring the debt that they have. What about the U.S.? Because the U.S. obviously has given a lot of debt as well, and other countries around the world. Are these other countries following suit of China's lead on this, or does it differ by region?
Oh, China is not leading. China is being pressured. China would prefer not to write off a cent. It wants to come and collect. It's just that, again, everyone, because the Europeans, the US, and the multilaterals collectively are suspending interest payments and calling for more moratorium. It's really going back to like the Jubilee movement, of the 1990s in terms of debt forgiveness. And I hope that happens, quite frankly. Lisa, I know they're never going to pay off this debt. There's no point.
Right.
And their children, literally, it just makes no sense. I mean, I'm not like a left-wing economist, but you should all read David Graeber's books, on debt, because it just tells you that. I mean, because there's so much debt, there's no such thing as money. It's all credit. We just keep on issuing credit, right? We're never ever gonna actually
You're
collect
singing
it.
my song, yeah, exactly. The digital contract.
Well, no, you can choose inflation, war, or generosity, right? In terms of how you deal with these things. And I think that I would just hope that we have this collective generational maturing process where we can solve this in the third way rather than the first two. So that's what's going on right now. That's what's really at stake. I mean, let's take this opportunity to step back from the news headlines and talk about how you actually solve a problem, not just how you kick it down the road for 2 weeks. And those are your options right there.
Yeah, wonderful, and a very positive message in times where people need sort of leadership in that direction. So thank you. So switching gears a little bit more to your main theme of your recent book, The Future is Asia, I'm sorry, and that there's enormous amount of growth potential and growth that we're actually seeing all around the Asian world. You get this idea of growth, and growth is a metric that we use right now to measure prosperity. How do you feel about that concept of growth? Is growth the only thing? And how do you think that's going to impact, and what are the implications on behaviors when we focus on that one metric of growth, such as the part of our GDP metric?
This is one of these areas where I think that we hear it a lot, use it as shorthand for a directional indicator, but we don't fixate as much as we used to on the number, because we've had these ongoing conversations and research agendas over the last 10 years to come up with other metrics. I use the SPI, the Social Progress Index, which is an amalgamation of a wide range of indicators: environmental, economic, social, and I think that is more useful for kind of rating a country's kind of overall, the well-being that it delivers. China, as you know, in the last 72 hours has just moved away from growth targeting for the first time in 40 years. In Europe, no one expects growth, so why even talk about it? Only on CNBC in America do you talk about European growth, because in Europe they know they're not gonna have any growth, because they don't have productivity, they don't have technology investments, and they don't have people. So if your factor inputs of production are not exactly aligning, you're not gonna have growth. In the U.S., of course, we still obsess about it on a kind of quarterly level, and that's a particularly like American thing. But it's in America where some of these conversations have actually, at least in academic circles, been making solid progress. So I don't think there is a collective we that obsesses about growth. I think that it is about quality of life. I think that obviously this is a cliche at this point, but the environmental factor, if it's not internalized into how we make these calculations, it's bunk, and we should, never teach people to, pursue GDP growth if we're not, if we are not taking into account externalities. So, this is an evolutionary kind of moment, but I think that we're past the point where we can assert, everyone's focused on GDP. It's sort of like, in a way, we are until we're not. So let's just not. And I think there are many people who are not. And I think those people really matter. I think there are entire countries that have started to shift away, and then I forgot to mention, one other major country like India. I mean, India's growth is so incredibly volatile and fluctuating every year, every 2 years, that there's never been real meaningful growth targeting anyway. So if China's abandoned it, in India it's meaningless. Europe gave on it a long time ago. There really isn't a global obsession anymore.
Yeah, well, that's a very positive message. So it sounds like actually you're leading into sort of this next area, which is this contrast of how the U.S. is looking at things sort of more from a growth perspective, while the rest of the world starts decoupling from that construct. So when you're in your talk, you were talking about this sort of the three speed world, which are the three regions, and then the versus contrasting the two speed world, which was the developed versus emerging economies. I'll call that a different dimension. Can you compare and contrast what you see right now as sort of how you see evolving relationships between the US and Asia and Europe and Asia, and the geopolitical implications of those different types of emerging relationships?
Right. So it's a great question. So we have this like tri-regional divergence on the one hand, with the internal integration, the supply chain decoupling, the regionalism, the desire for self-sufficiency, pulling back from excessive dependence on China on the one hand. On the other hand, we have the desire to access those markets, right? To force China to open, to penetrate, level playing field, reciprocity, and all that stuff, the FTAs. So this is the nature of the beast. So on the one hand, even with Europe, which salivates over the Asia opportunity and growth and exports, especially Germany, on the other hand, sees that the playing field is not level, and so is declared China a strategic rival, and wants to force China to open up more. So I do think that this kind of sort of punitive pressure, this is where Europe and America agree. This is where they're handling things in a similar way. Let's not forget the investment screening, right, on the sort of on the receiving side, where both Europe and the U.S. now are very adamant that they're going to basically block Chinese investments that are not done in a reciprocal fashion, and where there's not enough transparency around the private nature of the ultimate beneficiaries and this kind of thing. India has just passed a law on that, Australia as well. So I think that being tough and demanding reciprocity is the way ultimately that you bring about change when you're dealing with a very powerful player like China. So the geopolitics of it are this. I mean, here's the interesting thing. If on the one hand you were to have anything like a real full decoupling, right, of these regions, then technically you'd be saying, well, why do we need to interfere in each other's sphere of influence, right? If Asia doesn't need energy from any other region, Europe doesn't, North America certainly doesn't. Why do we have these intrusive interests? Why do we have the Carter Doctrine, right, for, protecting Gulf oil flows? Why do we need to protect the Philippines or Taiwan or Japan? And, this is part of what the retrenchment kind of school of thought is about, saying we don't really need, these are legacy commitments that we have dating back to the Cold War, the 1990s, but they don't reflect America's interests in a world where America has total energy independence and really needs to invest in North American integration more than any other relationship in the world. And I'm, even as an internationalist and an expat, I'm partial to that school of thought, either based on guns versus butter logic, or the logic that offshore balancing, could be sufficient. And the third logic being that, Asians and other and Arabs and those in the Middle East need to sort out their own problems. And the American presence is an artificial crutch that is a suspension of reality. And the reality is that geography is destiny, and you have to learn to get along with your neighbors. And if you always have American nuclear weapons parked right behind you, then you're really not learning to deal on, sort of equal terms. So this is where the conversation with Taiwan was starting to go prior to Trump's election. The Philippines, with Japan as well. So these things, we don't have an answer. We don't have a crystal ball on these issues. We're going to see one by one, one relationship at a time, how they play out. But there should technically be less need. But here's the flip side of it. Funny enough, where you decline when you reduce foreign investment in a country, you have less reason to have amicable relations with that country, because you're no longer dependent on them for either their supply chains and production or for their revenues they're generating for your multinational companies. And so you can actually potentially take greater risks in your geopolitical confrontations. At least that's the way what the theory holds. So in other words, countries that trade with each other can go to war, but countries that invest a lot in each other don't tend to. So the volume or intensity of investment is the single strongest correlating, sort of factor to strong positive relations. But Chinese investment in the United States has dropped to zero. There is effectively no Chinese foreign investment in the United States of America right now, zero. But there's lots of American investment in China. Now, let's say Wilbur Ross and Steve Mnuchin and everyone get their way, and American multinationals were to actually pick up stakes and pull back. Well, first of all, Apple would only be worth $500 billion, not $1 trillion. First, maybe even less. That's one consequence you better be ready for. And I believe that means all of you, because we all own Apple stock in some way, shape, or form. So we better be ready for our companies to be worth a lot less than they are right now, because if they're not making things cheaply and not selling them in Asia, that's a problem. Right? I mean, as it is, our valuations are ludicrously inflated. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, well, then, what's the incentive, for China to, if suddenly they're not getting the investment from us, we're not creating jobs in their country. Why do they have to hold back? Right? Why don't they just bomb the hell out of our aircraft carriers? So this is really one of those be careful what you wish for things, because history teaches that it's a good idea to remain invested, in your rivals to some degree.
Right. Thank you. That's very interesting. So what you're saying here is that whilst we're regional, we're always still global, because we're still sharing the same planet, and be careful that there are consequences on the other side when you don't have things that you think, you perceive you can lose on that. So interesting point on that. You touched on something before I leave this idea of geopolitical implications and also supply chain that you talked about Apple and how things are made cheaply. As you look at the infrastructure and supply chains, it's pretty easy to move garment making and sort of lower technology-based products manufacturing-wise out of China or out of Asia. But it's really hard to take those hard cost silicon, chip making that require high volume and very specific high-tech manufacturing processes. Do you see that actually moving out of China or out of Asia, or having more of a global footprint? And does that happen quickly, or does that happen over a longer period of time with other pressure?
Well, I mean, semiconductors, as you know, are something of a holy grail, right? In a way, on par with the most advanced, biomedical research. For example, there's certain key geographies in the world where there really is a hierarchy, and these days you can build an electric car anywhere. I mean, we can 3D print an electric car nowadays, right? But when it comes to semiconductors, you've got the chip design, you've got the precision equipment, the foundries, the chip making facilities, right? So you've got 5 or 6 key pillars of the semiconductor value chain, and these are geographically dispersed. So already, again, this goes back at least 5-6 years before the trade war, before Trump, with China saying semiconductors, that's the only thing left. Well, other than make a good airplane, which they can't do, it's definitely certain precision, instrumentation. That's, where the Germans and Japanese have a lock on that. Advanced industrial robotics, Koreans and Japanese are still better than semiconductors. So China, 5-6 years ago said, in our next, technology plan, these are the priorities, right? That's what we want to aim for. And of course, knowing, ever since Trump was elected, they knew that this was coming, right? And so they knew that to start making their own chipsets. They may not have known that, Google was going to throw Huawei off of the Android platform, but they are actually prepared for it. That's why they created their own operating system, right? So you see a lot of this accelerated effort at import substitution. So when it comes to these, again, these 5 or 6 verticals in the semiconductor value chain, you know, between China, Japan, Taiwan, well, let's just say the leaders being obviously Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, China, a little bit Singapore. So you have in Asia an enormous presence of these players. It's really about regulations, licensing, IP protection, joint ventures, IP theft, and then the geopolitics of who's allowed to sell to whom. That's what's going on right now. But all the while, you have China trying to obviously, strengthen its indigenous capabilities. There's
Right.
pretty much no area. Ultimately, look, the law of technology diffusion prevails, right? You go back to the crossbow and the musket and the gun and nuclear weapons. Ultimately, technology gets out such that even North Korea can build a nuclear weapon, right? So you can't stop a country from having a big AI sector, right? China leads in AI, right? And AI is not even that so much about hardware, to the extent it is obviously with supercomputers and quantum computing. Well, they have that, and to the extent it's about brains, well, they have that too. So you're going to get AI everywhere. You've got huge AI in India now. So when it comes to these things, it can be done. It's just a question of when. And so when people look at this and they say, okay, well, when will China have 5 nanometer, sort of chips? Well, the answer is probably within like a couple of years, right? So, it's a very temporary blow that they have been dealt
Right.
by the situation right now.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you on that. One more question before we open it up to our participants and do that. A question a little bit outside of the things that we've talked about. So we've seen right now that there's a lot of growth that has happened, and that growth has been a consequence of urbanization. And right now, with pandemic, people are now rethinking how they want to live. And I would love to get your thoughts on how you see it, particularly from Asia, when the cities were a major part of their growth, how you see people wanting to live in the future. Is it an urban base, non-urban base, or what are the implications of that?
It's so interesting. For me, it's almost like a bitter pill. I mean, I've been writing about cities and urbanization and planetary, urbanization for 15 years, and then you get a moment like this, where I just did a piece, a long essay for Politico last weekend, kind of saying, well, this could be peak urbanization. And it's a combination of many things: the cost of living in cities, climate change, and obviously coastal surges of mega cities. And obviously now the remote working factor, many drivers of the potential de-urbanization trend. And on the one hand, you think, oh, well, it'll take time. It will be different everywhere, but it's also kind of like a survival reflex. And you think about what percentage of the human population lives in coastal areas that are going to be inundated by rising sea levels. Even if you love cities, you obviously have to have a backup plan. Like, humanity needs a backup plan. And so I've been doing, sort of no, it's no secret. This is my entire next book. It's kind of sort of the future of human geography. I'm trying to answer the question as to where, if there are 9 billion people in the year 2050, I want to answer the question, like, where will they be and why, and how did they get there, and why are they there versus somewhere else? And you have to take into account climate change above all else, but also where will technology sort of place us? What about populism and nationalism and xenophobia and demographic imbalances and labor markets? You have to take into account 1,000 things to figure out why we are, or why we will be where we will be. And it's super complex. There's no, we won't know the answer till we get there, but I'm making all these kind of scenarios and forecasts. But a lot of it involves definitely moving from south to north, obviously, from coastal to interior, from expensive to cheap. And the pandemic is accelerating all of those things. So there's a lot of speculation out there right now that we're probably hearing around which second tier cities in the US are going to benefit the most from the coastal exodus, the Texodus out of Silicon Valley. Now Twitter, Facebook, Google saying you don't have to, go to the office anymore. This is the triumph of the kind of remote software engineer, the guy or girl who for the last 5 years has been telling his bosses and in Silicon Valley, why do you make me live in the Valley? Why do you make me live in San Francisco? I don't ever come to the office. I just code all day. Let me live in Montana. And now that person gets to say, told you so, and they're going to start buying those farms in Montana, and they couldn't care less about whether or not they live in downtown San Francisco. So they are gonna get out of there big time. And but there are other parts of the world, Lisa, where and for generations, a younger generation of people doesn't get their first job just by hanging out on the internet. You got to go press the flesh. You've got to network and all that kind of stuff. So there's already a lot of people making the very practical and important, humane point that the Generation Z graduating college, if it can't go and circulate and network and meet people in cities, how is it ever going to get its foot in the door in companies, and how are they ever going to advance their careers? And this is a big issue to deal with. Obviously people who are already very advanced in their careers and can go live in the Hamptons or Montana and just work remotely, they don't need to network physically anymore, right? We're past that point. But what about everyone else? What about the 60% of the world population that's under the age of 40? Those are the people we have to be thinking about. So no good answers right now, other than yes, I would say safely we have actually reached peak urbanization.
Great, that's interesting. I think there are pluses and minuses. You raised a couple different dimensions I didn't even think about. And maybe the age-old issue with the two-career couple, maybe it's no longer an issue anymore because they don't have to make a choice. So maybe there are great things that can happen out of this.
Yeah, so this was already true when it comes to leaving expensive Western cities for developing countries. So this is why European families move to Dubai. Sort of usually in the case of Dubai, it's the husband, who has a job in finance in London, gets moved to Dubai, gets the same big salary, but now you don't have to be a two-income household because you're living in a much cheaper country, and you get, cooks and maids and cleaners and drivers and staff and everything, and you don't have to pay London prices. So there are many urban places in the world where you can, be a one-income household. Without having, but leaving your own country. It's tougher to do in your own country if it's a Western country, because it's not like the sort of price disparity is significant between living in San Francisco and living in like Oklahoma, but chances are you would still be a two-income like household to some degree. Yeah.
Well, thank you. The book sounds exciting. It looks like we all have now an insight into what the future writings are from you. Thank you very much, Parag. So let's go into. I loved our conversation. I could go on for hours. Unfortunately, I have to allow other people to speak too. So we're going to try to get everybody get some questions answered from the audience. So I'm just going to start off with the first questions we have and take them from there. So the first one so if totalitarian China grows, is there a threat to the world?
Well, the thing is that we fixated a lot on China as if it has a linear pathway to global, hegemony simply because it wants to. And that's wrong, because that's not the way history works. The more your intentions are known, the more resistance it evokes. And so the kind of punchline of my Asia book is that the reaction to China's actions is more important than China's actions. Even if you do impute the worst of possible intentions to China, that's precisely what everyone in Asia already knows. I live here. Everyone knows that China has hegemonic aspirations. That's precisely why you have such a resistance to Belt and Road. That's why you have the Quad initiative around naval cooperation in the Indo-Pacific domain. This is why everyone is suspicious of China. So the point is that the backlash against China is literally more important than whatever China is doing, because ultimately it's the backlash that wins. The backlash always wins. It's like empires. It's like, Return of the Jedi. And this is something that it's a position I've been pressing for a long time, to simply view the world from the point of view of most of the people in the world, and most of the people in the world live in countries that are former British colonies or European colonies, or countries that were, divided in Cold War geopolitics. So you still have leaders all over the world alive today, and you certainly have the vast majority of the human population can relate to either being a British colonial subject, like my parents can, remember that, not very fondly, or Cold War divisiveness. So now you have a third cycle in people's current lives where they're saying, oh, now along comes China, and they want to either be the new British East India Company or the new superpower. We don't want that. You can't fool me a third time in my own lifetime. And that's why the backlash against China has been so quick, because everyone sees it coming. People in India didn't see the British East India Company turning into the Raj, so instantaneously. It took 150 years for it to accrete that size, right? And the Cold War played out of these long timescales. Everything that China has done and the reaction it's evoked has taken place in like a whopping 3 years, right? Because then that just shows you what a different world is. So just because China wants something, I mean, look, I served in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Like, I know that just because we wanted Iraq or Afghanistan to be, westernized, liberal or pro-Western, democracies, that's not exactly the way it turned out, right? So just because an empire or a superpower wants something, it doesn't mean it's going to get it. And when we talk about China, we tend to impute to them something that may not be true. We tend to tell ourselves what we think they want. Then we just assume that they're going to get it, because we assume that they're brilliant, strategic, long-term thinking, and stunningly crafty. And then we also assume the third part, that no one has any say in the matter other than them. And none of the above are true, and therefore I don't lose any sleep at night about this risk of teleological Chinese hegemony. It's actually not going to happen.
Interesting. So you can see the patterns. We know the play. You've studied it on the Sunday night or the Sunday night post game, and everybody sees it. Very interesting. Thank you.
Next. By the way, again, it is the difference. I have to say this again as an expat. Like, it is the difference between sort of the Washington think tank, like cubicle view of the world, and living here. You do not have to be a deep scholar of history or any of these things to know this. You just have to come and spend a week. In my case, I've spent like 5 or 6 years now living out here, and these things are blindingly obvious, right? The suspicion of China. For example, going back to debt traps, what do some of our diplomats do? They go around the world and we warn Nigeria and Kenya and Kazakhstan and Sri Lanka, you better watch out, you're getting caught in the Chinese debt trap. It's like, you think they don't know that? Like, it never occurred to them, right? So, it's like Captain Obvious has arrived, from Washington.
Our hero, right? Captain Obvious. I like it.
Telling us the things that like our grandparents, tell us at night in their bed. Because you just have to be like Asian, and literally the majority of the human population is Asian. It is obvious to them. It wasn't even as obvious to me, even though I was born in Asia, but I was so American, like when I came here, that I had to relearn some of these obvious obvious things. So again, seeing the way China's role will play out from the point of view of the majority of the world population shouldn't really be that hard.
Right. Great. Thank you. Exciting. Another question we have, with increased regionalization, how will US policy trade evolve in Latin America, and what countries will be the greatest beneficiaries?
Well, so it's hard to predict what U.S. policy towards anything is going to be. So I can't make any promises about having a pragmatic kind of hemispheric approach. Now, when I mention this sort of trifurcation of the world into these kind of longitudinal pan regions, as we call them in geopolitics, for the Western Hemisphere, I refer to North America, but I do mean obviously as well to include Latin America, because complementarities are so strong across North and South America, in so many respects: agriculture, energy, also just manpower, labor, cheap manufacturing that can be done in the hemisphere. It doesn't have to be done in the U.S. at high cost, or even the things that aren't done in Mexico, could be done in across the region. So I'm a big believer in taking advantage of the entire hemisphere. But what is happening right now? I mean, look, if you think about the last 10 years, where even the most basic aid packages like CAFTA, or the trade agreement, like strengthening Central America through free trade and increasing U.S. investment there, even those simple things are low-hanging fruit or controversial. Very touch and go relations, with Brazil, with Argentina. So it's too bad. It's still very fractured, and obviously, most fundamentally, if we can't get Mexico right, it's sort of like, come on. I once, I've spent my career mostly outside of our immediate North American region, but I once had to write a piece, or felt compelled to write an essay for foreign policy, um, titled "Look South, Not East," and it was about how we just obsess about the Middle East and East Asia, but come on, can we America, right? And I remember a number of State Department officials writing to me saying, "Thank you for doing this piece." And it was really like a glib throwaway op-ed. It wasn't like the deepest sort of thinking I've ever done, but it was, again, just sort of like, how can we be out on the other side of the planet, screwing up in societies we never understood, and meanwhile we have 200 years of history with Latin America, and we can't get these obvious things right. And a lot of people do work obviously on Latin America, across our all the time, across every administration, in our bureaucracy, and they're always neglected. They never get priority. And I've always found that really sad, even though it's the region that I've spent the least time on, but it's also the most obviously important one for us.
All right, thank you. That question was really relevant to me too, because I think we have missed that, and our roots are very similar in North America and South America. And I know personally, my grandparents both immigrated to Argentina and into New York. And so, and I think, which one was better off when they immigrated? Argentina. Then it switched, and I wonder when that will ever.
So do they.
Exactly. Next question. Thank you, because everybody's excited here with questions. If the Europe-Asia-China trade going to grow, how do we see Germany's recent behavior to consider China as a competitor, or worse? Who else can follow Germany, France, or UK?
Well, okay, so again, I mentioned earlier that European countries are being much stricter on China when it comes to investment screening. So they're not going to accept Chinese, even though China is obviously trying to get on a buying spree. They're not going to, I mean, some countries like Italy probably will sell a lot of assets off because they have to. And they're part of Belt and Road, whereas other major European economies are not. But the large European economies, the leaders, are going to be much tougher and practice this investment restriction, especially in strategic assets. Britain has said that it's going to kind of, pull Huawei out gradually of its telecom infrastructure and so forth, at least in critical sectors. And so declaring China a strategic rival is different from saying that You want to do business in China. You want to benefit from China's infrastructure investment. So again, the debate about Belt and Road is not whether or not infrastructure investment, is good is important as a platform for growth. It's who gets to do the projects. One of the on that final slide where I was saying, this map explains why Europe thinks differently. Um, if you look at I have another slide somewhere that kind of looks at what are the top 25 engineering and construction companies in the world. And lo and behold, 23 out of 25 are Eurasian. Half of those are European and the other half are Asian. Precisely two are American, Bechtel and Fluor, and they're way too expensive to be doing a huge amount of business in developing countries. So you basically have, all of the world's largest engineering companies are European or Asian. So they're Swiss, Italian, German, French, or Korean, Japanese, Chinese, and Indian, and a couple of Turks thrown in. And they all have a unified interest in wanting to do these big infrastructure projects. So yes, China is a rival, whether it's ideological, but it's really about saying that China is an unfair competitor in who gets the business. Because what Europeans and Asians have in common is that they think much more with their wallets, basically, than anything
pragmatic.
else. Yeah. So what, again, talking tough on China in an American sounding way is not Europe's way of saying that they've given up on engaging with Asia and are going to go to a confrontational approach like the US. It's Europe's way of saying, if we don't talk tough on China, then they'll never open up further so that we can do more business there, right? That's what it's really about.
Well, Parag, thank you so much. I'm going to actually say that at this point we have to wrap up. We're already late, but as you know, I mean, all of our conversations, everybody would love to engage further with you. There's still a few questions unanswered in the queue. May I send them to you, and can they get, have those answered by you? Is that possible?
You want me to do like a 1 minute rapid fire on the remaining questions right now?
I think, Courtney, you have to tell us,
Sure, go for it. I would love to see this. This is great.
Okay. Questions, rapid fire, and then I'll thank you to you, because honestly, I really could talk to you for hours, and I'm sure everybody in our audience could talk to you for hours as well. So thank you. So thanks, Parag. Awesome presentation. How does the forecast for growing Eurasian trade square with the notion that European economies are sclerotic? Is the idea that while growth in Europe may continue to be slow, Italy has not recovered from its pre-crisis levels, more of this trade will be with Asia than with the EU partners? That's one. And then the next one is, what are the major security concerns that may arise in coming times? How about non-state actors and their role?
Okay, so on the first question, first of all, big shout out to Bogdan, old friend. Hello there. And great to hear from you. A precise, incisive question as always. So here's the thing. So there's been a realization, right, that as much as the peripheral countries of Europe really resent Germany and the fiscal politics, they all realize they need to be a bit more like Germany in terms of focusing on exports. And that's what the Italy joining Belt and Road issue was really all about, was Italy saying, hey, how come, Germany gets to, sort of bash on China, but trades much more with China than we do. We want in on that action, right? So it's this recognition that, they are slow growth. They do have to export more. They do have to Germanize themselves a little bit. So it's a bit ironic, but that's what's going on there. In terms of security concerns, this is a great question. So, I think obviously about now these non-traditional threats like environmental issues, migration issues. Every military in the world today is focused on COVID-19, right? Every military in the world right now is either putting out forest fires or building hospitals for COVID patients. We don't have, we also have obviously the risk of World War III over Taiwan. We still have, we have right now the Sino-Indian border dispute yet again flaring up. So we have a mix of all of these threats. But I just want to emphasize that I really don't view a lot of these territorial disputes, these legacy territorial disputes, as being a spark for a global war like a World War I or World War II, because these are very localized and Asians don't like these domino effects of alliances. So in Western history, we have these rigid alliances and escalations and so forth, but Asians don't really have alliances in such a way that they would fall into war in a broad regional way because of one conflict. They would rather just sit on the sidelines and watch and see what happens. So I don't think that just because one of these conflicts will break out, it doesn't mean all of them will. But I do think we should be worried about more mass migration flows and destabilization for sure. So I think that's it.
Right, which is sort of the subject of your next book, which is great. Thank you for having us all start our day here, or wherever we are in the world, with a lot of thoughts to provoke us to think further and open our minds. So that is a wonderful gift, and thank you for your positive energy with that. Thank you for joining us. Have a great
Yeah.
day.
Yeah. Just echoing. Yeah. Thank you, Parag. Thank you, Lisa, for a terrific conversation. For those who are still listening, we do have a couple of great ones coming up next week. On Monday, June 1st at 12, we have Andrew Basovich, who's of the Quincy Institute, speaking on the age of illusions and how to fix U.S. foreign policy. So that should be really interesting. And on, I believe, Thursday, June 4th, we have Thomas Graham, 2 p.m. Eastern time, talking about Putin and the pandemic, what's to come in Russia. And not on our website yet, but I think it has been confirmed, should be for Monday the 8th at 11 a.m. Eastern with Anthony Phillipson, the Consul General of the UK in New York, talking about the US-UK trade deal. So we have a lot of interesting stuff coming up. This, I believe, will be posted to our YouTube channel, Parag, if you're okay with that. So you can give another listen and share around. And please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter to get the latest updates. And you everyone have a great night, Parag. Have a great day, everyone, wherever you are. So good to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you.